Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Civic Signal. Today, we're going to be talking about a paper that both me and Sam really enjoy. We're going to just go over what the paper says, what the results were, how they conducted the study, and then we're going to have a quick discussion about the implications, what we think are the important takeaways, and how we should change or adjust how we look at politics moving forward. So, sit back and enjoy it. We hope you have as much fun watching it as we did talking about it.
Well, the paper we're going to be discussing today is Does Party Trump Ideology? Disentangling Party and Ideology in America by Dr. Michael Barber and Dr. Jeremy C. Pope, both professors of political science at Brigham Young University, where Brandon and I are students right now. Um, so, just to start off, this paper exists kind of in this broader conversation about how rational are voters? What kinds of things are they taking into account? Are they just blindly following a party like they would a sports team, staying loyal no matter what? Or are they really analyzing every single policy issue, every single vote? And that's going to kind of be a principle we're going to come back to as we discuss this paper. The authors start their paper with a very simple question that their research is focused on. They say, "Are people conservative because they are Republicans, or is it the reverse? People are Republicans because they're conservatives." And ultimately, that's what this paper explores: are people choosing the party because of the policies, or are people going along with policies because that's what the party is pushing?
Yeah, and the authors they kind of model voters into two groups. The first group that they model is the partisan loyalists, and these are the people who merely take the party line on any issue. On the other hand, uh, they model the policy loyalists. And the policy loyalists are kind of the opposite. They have faithful principles and policy positions that they stick to no matter what the party does. And so you can see how these two groups are kind of opposites of each other. And so this paper is kind of exploring, um, you know, do we have a lot of party loyalists, partisan loyalists?
Yeah. So the paper is it's a modern piece of literature. So it's looking at the current political climate, and so they researched this question specifically using Donald Trump as their example of people if people are evaluating his policies and their policies and their party choices, or if they're following his cues. Now, Donald Trump is also a really interesting figure in political science research and in the political science field because he's very different than a lot of other politicians. And we're not here to discuss, are his policies good or bad? And that's not what this research paper does either. But Donald Trump is somebody who's been in the public eye for a very long time. He's been on TV, he's been taking interviews with, you know, different media figures for decades, even before he ever ran for public office. And then when he did run for public office, he ran as sort of this figure of change within the Republican Party. And so that's going to be really important as they do this study because Trump is such a unique figure that when it comes to his policies, he's a lot harder to nail down, and he hasn't necessarily been staying super consistent throughout his whole public life, like other people who maybe have been running, and the whole time they've been in the public eye, they've been affiliated with a certain political party electorally their whole time.
And so Trump being such a unique figure offers an amazing opportunity for a really, really cool research design. So because Donald Trump has been, in the public eye for so long and in so many different contexts, he's credited with a lot of statements on both sides of different political issues. So the authors, they pick 10 political issues where Trump has made statements or taken positions on both sides of the issue. And they run a survey in which they present 1,300 YouGov respondents with a policy. So basically, what they do is they split the 1,300 respondents into two groups. They have a control group and a treatment group. The control group is given a policy, and the example that they give in the um, paper is Please indicate whether or not you support or oppose the statement to increase the minimum wage to over $10 an hour. And the respondents can say if they support, oppose, or don't know. Now, the treatment group receives the same policy. However, they also are given a statement from Donald Trump whether or not he agrees or opposes um, the policy. So some of the respondents receive a liberal Trump statement, they call it a Q, and some of the respondents receive a conservative Trump Q. And then they can indicate whether they support or oppose the policy. And by comparing these two groups, we can kind of see how much the Trump Q influences the respondents' approval of the policy. Now, because Donald Trump is the case study here, we're mostly focused on the results from Republicans. And that's not to pick on Republicans, that's just to say how much they rely on the Trump Q because he's their political leader.
Right. Also, to sort of test the uniqueness of this effect to Trump, some of the respondents were not given a cue from Donald Trump, but it would say congressional Republicans support this policy or oppose this policy, so that we can sort of see, are people following the party generally, or is it really the strong cues from leaders of the party and President Trump specifically? Um, so the researchers, Dr. Pope and Dr. Barber, had they had a central hypothesis, and then they sort of broke that down into some more specific hypotheses. So their central hypothesis was that the influence of a Trump queue will show that there's a large block of the voting population who are party loyalists, and that they will move significantly based on the cue that is given to them from Donald Trump. Basically, meaning that there are going to be people who will, regardless of their own opinion on the policy going into this survey, if they see that Donald Trump takes the more liberal position on it, they're going to be more likely to vote in the liberal direction on that policy. And if they see that President Trump supports the conservative side of the issue, then they're going to be more likely to support the conservative side.
And then, like Sam was saying, there's some kind of sub-hypotheses here. The first of which is the authors hypothesize that people who score on the lower end of political knowledge will react to the cue more than people who are higher levels of political knowledge. And kind of the logic here is that people who know more about politics, in theory, should be a little bit more reliant on policy rather than partisanship on their political opinion.
Yep. They had another hypothesis was that those who are more willing to self-identify with a party or say that they are strongly Republican or strongly Democrat are going to be more likely to be party loyalists. And so those who, specifically in this case, are identifying as strong Republicans are going to follow the cues that Donald Trump gives more than other people who identify only as weak Republicans or as independents or members of the Democrat Party.
And then, in a very similar vein, the next hypothesis is the approval hypothesis. Those people who approve more of Trump are going to rely more on the Trump cue than the people who approve less of Trump, and kind of for the same reason as those who more strongly affiliate with the GOP.
Exactly. And then their last hypothesis, they call it the symbolic ideology hypothesis, which is to say that individuals who say that they are strongly conservative are more likely to be policy loyalists, basically meaning if you self-identify strongly with a political ideology, that you're probably more likely to go along with the policies associated with the ideology, not necessarily the leaders who say that they support that ideology. And so we're going to kind of get into some of the results here, both broadly and with their specific hypotheses, and look at whether their predictions were right or wrong and how strong exactly these effects are.
So here is a figure that represents kind of the general finding from this survey. And this speaks to the general hypothesis that the authors have. So this graph on the y-axis, you have the change in probability of voting for a liberal policy. So the dotted line across the center is 0, and that means that there was no change. And anything above the dotted line indicates a positive change in the probability of voting for the liberal policy. And then below is a negative change, and you can kind of interpret that as an increase in the conservative direction. So this first column of 3 bars is the people who received a liberal Trump Q. And this is in comparison to the control group. So as you can see, the Republicans who received the liberal Trump Q had an over 0.15 increase in their probability to vote for the liberal policy. The Democrats are right at 0, and the independents are slightly more likely. However, you can see this bar that overlaps the dotted line. That's what's called a confidence interval. The confidence interval accounts for uncertainty in sampling and statistical methods. And basically, what it means is that if we were to repeat this experiment and run the survey a lot of times, there's a high likelihood that most of the coefficients are going to appear in this bar. And so, because this bar overlaps 0, we can't be sure that there actually is an effect here. And so, looking further into the graph, any bar that overlaps 0, you can kind of interpret it as a not significant change in probability of voting for a liberal policy.
And then when we look at the conservative Trump, that middle section there, we see that Republicans are, while not as strongly as in the liberal section, they are more likely to follow the queue and vote in support of the conservative policy there. We also see that Democrats are slightly more likely to vote in favor of the Trump queue there, and that, we're not entirely sure why that happened, and it's not really explored uh, a lot by the researchers. It's also a very, very slight effect. And then the independents there are slightly likely to sort of react adversely to the Trump queue, but again, with that confidence interval crossing 0, it's such a small effect. The last section that we see here is the Republicans in Congress section. As you can see, all of the effects are either 0 or very close to 0, with the confidence intervals for all 3 of those markers crossing the 0 line. So essentially what this tells us is that the effect is pretty unique to Donald Trump, especially in the effect on Republicans. And people are not really following the cue for generic, oh, the Republicans think this, as much as they are for Donald Trump has said that he supports this side of this issue.
So, taken in whole, this first figure supports the general hypothesis. It does appear that there are a large block of partisan loyalists in the Republican Party who are following the Trump queue and shifting their positions according to what they hear that Trump believes. So now we're going to just jump into really quickly the results from the sub-hypotheses and whether or not they supported what the authors originally thought.
So this graph here is looking at the treatment by political knowledge. So they're on the x-axis. We have 0 through 8, and this represents 0 being the lowest level of political knowledge, 8 being the highest level of political knowledge. And this scale actually comes from a series of questions about how the government functions and sort of things going on in the government and policy that the respondents had to answer for themselves, and this assigned them a score here. So this is not self-reported. And then along the y-axis, we have basically how strong the effect is for these different people. And with their hypothesis that the higher level of political knowledge, the lower the effect is going to be, we see exactly that when we see the liberal Trump treatment. The lower the level of political knowledge, the more likely that that is to move them in the liberal direction, and then it consistently decreases throughout those levels.
So looking at the B panel here on this graph, these are those of the respondents that received the conservative Trump treatment. We see a really similar story at the lowest levels of political knowledge. These are the people who reacted the most to the Trump queue. However, it's a little bit different in that the trend in effect crosses 0 at about the halfway point on this political knowledge scale. And those with the highest levels of political knowledge actually reacted inversely to the Trump queue, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, this next graph is looking at the partisan hypothesis, which is that those who are more loyal to the Republican Party are going to be more likely to follow the queue. And once again, this hypothesis is shown to be true. It's sorted from those who say that they're independents, they lean toward the Republican Party, they're weak Republicans and strong Republicans. And we see that the independents are affected by the Trump queue in the liberal direction a little bit, more so with those who lean toward the party than the weak Republicans, and then the strong Republicans with the strongest effect. And then with the conservative Trump treatment, we see once again the independents are more likely to actually be turned off by that Trump queue and go in the liberal direction when they see that he supports the conservative policy. And then with each of the Republicans, it's just a stronger and stronger effect. With the lean GOP, basically, it's essentially a zero effect there. Then the weak Republicans have a somewhat of an effect, and then the strongest effect with those who are most likely to strongly identify as part of the Republican Party.
This next one is very similar. This is the effect by approval of Trump. On the left side of each panel is the people who strongly disapprove, and you could see that there's basically no movement with the Trump queue if you strongly disapprove of Trump. And then as your level of approval of Trump increases, the effect of the Trump queue also increases very similarly to the level of partisanship.
Yeah, so far, each one of their sub hypotheses and their general hypothesis, they've been correct in. Looking at this last chart, which looks at the symbolic ideology hypothesis, we actually see the first time that the researchers were not correct, which their hypothesis was that individuals who say that they're strongly conservative are going to be more likely to be policy loyalists or to not follow the queue because they're going to say, well, I see that Donald Trump likes this liberal view, this liberal policy on abortion, but I'm a conservative. That's not my view, so I'm not going to follow the queue. What they find here is that self-described ideology, or how strongly an individual says that they follow a certain ideology, like here being a conservative, being a liberal, it acts the exact same as the party identification, with those who are strongly liberal through moderates through strong conservatives, having the effect in that order become stronger and stronger. Um, now, the authors have a great sentence in here that sums up this finding. They say the clear implication of this is that when individuals describe themselves as conservatives, it has more of a partisan tinge than is conventional wisdom in the literature. So basically, when people say, I'm a conservative, what they mean is, I really identify with the Republican Party. Now, there are people in the Republican Party who are not strongly conservative, who are more centrists. There are people in the Republican Party who are very strongly conservative and follow an ideological trajectory very strongly. But what they find here is that when people just hear the word conservative, they mostly think aligned with the leaders who say that they are conservative, or aligned with the party that is the more conservative party.
All right, so now we're going to discuss a little bit about what we think are the important implications from these results. Um, I think the first question that should be in everybody's mind after reading this is this effect unique to Trump, or can we apply these results also to independents and Democrats? Now, the authors do a really quick, they call it a robustness check, to see if there's like a proof of concept that this could be applicable outside of the Republican Party. In 2018, the Trump administration adopted an immigration policy that was almost exactly the same as an immigration policy that existed in the Obama administration. And so this provided another opportunity for a survey to see if respondents were more or less approving of the policy, if they thought it came from Trump or thought it came from Obama. And basically, what they found is that Democrats, on a 5-point scale, were about a point more likely to approve of the policy if they found out it came from Obama. And on the other hand, Republicans were about a third point more likely to approve of it if they learned it came from Trump. And so this suggests that maybe there is a similar effect that can be expanded just beyond Republicans. And I think this is kind of in conflict to what we saw on the general hypothesis graph, where we didn't see a lot of movement for the general Republican queue. So what do you think? Why do you think we saw movement when it was Trump versus Obama, but not Trump versus the generic Republican?
That's a good question. I think that, first of all, nobody really cares what Congress does. I mean, if you go to a Democrat and you're like, "Oh, what do you think about all the Democrats in Congress?" They're gonna pretty consistently be like, "Oh, a couple of them are good, but blah, blah, blah." Same thing with Republicans. There's a couple, but even people who are highly politically knowledgeable are gonna have a couple politicians who they really strongly agree with on some things, but most of the people they're gonna be like, "Oh, Congress, they don't really do anything." And so I think that cues from individual leaders are really important. I think it's also important that these are specific policies that were actually enacted by these administrations. And so for them to be like, oh yeah, Obama did have that policy, or oh, that sounds like something Obama would do. I think that that's a big part of it too, because just to say, oh, the party thinks this, is a lot different to say, oh, Donald Trump has made it his policy to do this with immigration. So I think there's kind of a, I don't know, it invokes more out of you to hear the name specifically. And it also feels like maybe the administration has done more positively or negatively, or has more of an effect on that than just some Republicans in Congress. I also think what you were saying is important, that this isn't necessarily, this is just a sort of a check to say, is this happening externally at all? This isn't to say, oh, all of the effects that we found here, we can extrapolate across all other political leaders individually by name. This is
To the
just to say,
number. Yeah.
right, exactly, to the number. This is just to say, okay, obviously, people are following cues from leaders. These results we can pretty confidently say are happening with Republicans, with Donald Trump. Uh, it seems like, at least to some extent, something like this also happens with other leaders at times.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know if I have too much more to add to that. I think the the huge strength of this paper is the realism that the respondents face, where this really was an Obama policy, this really was a Trump policy. These are real positions Trump took. That means a lot, and it's going to be very, very easy to measure a strong signal from the data. Um, and I think it would be a little harder, a little more noisy, a little more fuzzy when it's just like, oh, Republicans also agree with this. You don't know which Republicans they're talking about. You don't know if that's even true. If you Google
Right.
that, you're not going to find the statement like you would for the Trump questions. So I think you're exactly right. Um, the authors in the discussion section here kind of have a uh, disappointed outlook in the results, maybe hoping that the voters were a little bit seemed a little bit more rational rather than just following the partisan cues. And I think that that's pretty easy to understand why that interpretation is maybe the most important. But do you think that there's any other reason why we might be seeing these movements with the partisan leaders?
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of a couple parts to it. I mean, the authors asked the question, they're like, how worried should we be by this? Like, oh, we found this effect definitely exists. There are people out here who are saying, okay, you know, Trump is moving in the liberal way. I'm just going to follow his cue. But this isn't necessarily only bad all of the time, because while it is definitely true that politics should be primarily focused on furthering policies that you think will have a positive effect, not everybody cares deeply and passionately about every single issue and has a high level of knowledge about everything. I mean, you're going to have one person who, follows, tax code and business policy and economic policy and trade policy a lot, and they just may not really keep up with a lot of social policies that have a lot of nuance. Alternatively, you may have someone who's very focused on policies dealing with civil rights and with civil liberties and with, constitutionality of things. And they are probably not going to care, or maybe if they do care because they want life to be better, they're not going to know a lot about the nuance of different financial and policies that are going to affect the economy. And so you have to rely on cues from leaders on some things, because if you have a leader, maybe it's President Trump, maybe it's a Democrat leader who has policies that they agree with you on the things that are the very most important to you, you're probably going to go along with the other things because you want them to stay in power so that they can enact the change in those things. So, yes, while it is true that if this is the main reason why people are voting for certain things, that's not good. Uh, some some level of this effect happening really just shows that parties are being effective. I mean, there's going to be some level of following cues, and that just means that parties are doing their job, and that's not inherently bad.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think to add on to that, one, I don't want to say weakness because I think these are really strong findings, but one limitation of these results is you just don't know how many people are following the cue of the leader. The effects that we see in these graphs are average effects across all respondents.
Right.
And so and then again, the effects are like, you're 10, 15, maybe 20% more likely to vote for the policy according to the Q.
Right.
Um, so that's, those numbers don't really line up with half of the Republicans are partisan loyalists. It seems like it's probably less than that. And so I think this supports your idea that maybe these results are like encouraging in the way that it kind of indicates that parties are functioning effectively in their coalition building functions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also important they take the time to point out that there's this idea that's been theorized and certainly exists in some areas called negative partisanship, which is saying I really don't like Trump, and therefore I'm going to really try to make sure that nothing he says works. And again, I mean, there are going to be some people who definitely do that with, on either side of the aisle, but the findings here are not really consistent to say that a
Mhm.
large portion of people really are just going to be totally turned off by anything that he says. Um, and so we see, and with the independents receiving the conservative Trump treatment, there's, they have a small likelihood to be turned more toward the liberal side, and then with strong liberals in the self-described ideology section, they're also they're slightly more likely to take the liberal side when they receive the conservative Trump treatment. But overall, I mean, the effect is very small, and it doesn't really hold across all of the tests. And so they say here, it doesn't really seem like, in general, when people receive a cue, they're really thinking, oh, well, I hate that guy, so I'm just going to go against everything he says, which is a positive thing
Mhm.
for American politics. A lot of the findings here are like, oh, I don't know how good that makes us look, but that's a good thing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the main takeaway from reading this, for me at least, is just a little bit of self-reflection. I think that would be what I would encourage everybody who's watching this to reflect on is why am I making the political decisions I'm making? Am I making this decision because a leader that I like in signaled to me that that's the decision I should make, or is it something I really believe? And again, it's not to say that on every uh, decision I make, I need to have a structured, uh, well thought out position. I just need to be really mindful about where I'm taking my cues and where I really want to be, uh, firm to my beliefs.
Right. And I think it's also important to realize like we're not going to be voting on every single policy issue. It's
Mhm.
not like when you go to the ballot, you actually have 10 policies. Okay, you're going to vote on the minimum wage law and on the abortion law and on the gun law and all of these things. Um, but mostly it's going to be supporting candidates. And
Yeah.
then it's our the way that we interact with each other that we're going to be really talking about these individual policies. And so I think it's important to evaluate candidates based on policy first and foremost when we vote for them. And it's totally okay to be like, okay, they really support the things that are the most important to me. I don't know that I love their stance on how hard it should be for a small business to get a loan, right? I mean, like, who knows? We're all going to have things that are less important to us, and you can just sort of follow their cue on those things and be like, that's not as important to me. But what is important is that we don't just blindly support everything that our favorite politician says in the way that we interact with each other. So much of what happens on social media, so much of what happens on the news is just taking the cues and saying, this is right, this is right, this is what we should do. And that's not really how we get good politics. It's, again, there's going to be some level of following cues that you're going to have to do when you vote. That's fine. But what you were saying, Brandon, is really important that it should be really an individual. Okay, why am I supporting this idea? Why am I supporting these things? And also, to what extent am I
Mhm.
going to support these things?
Mhm.
And if we all do that, then that's what makes American politics work. That's what makes democracy work. That's what makes a representative government work. And so I'm not as disheartened by by these results as a lot of people might be, but I think that there's definitely room for individuals to improve as they self analyze. Well, everybody, thanks for watching. This has been Sam and Brandon with the Civic Signal discussing does party trump ideology, uh, disentangling party and ideology in America by Dr. Michael Barber and Dr. Jeremy C. Pope. We've enjoyed our discussion. I hope that you have enjoyed it as well. Go ahead and hit subscribe and be on the lookout for future videos discussing literature and other political science topics. And because that's not a good thing, and that is not going to make America or wherever you are. That's not going to make it your life better.
You
But
almost said make America great again.